and then I have to prepare the live stream. I think we're live. Got it. Okay, so I'm not 100% sure that our YouTube stream is working, which I feel a little bit sad about. It is not. Yeah, so we're live on Facebook any second. We're live on Facebook now. We're trying to also be live on YouTube, but it's not going through. There's some problem with authentication. We don't know why. So we'll share it tomorrow to our YouTube page if we can't get it up and running. And I just realized too, I might have a small issue with my microphone. So I'm going to make sure that I'm plugged in. Yeah, I am. Okay. So welcome everyone to the Irish American Heritage Museum and our continuing Centenary, longest series ever of the War of Independence 1921. We're finally up to November 1921, and I was thinking for next year we may not do it monthly. We might kind of swap to a bi-monthly thing, because 1921 was such an intense year during the war itself, but like next year there's a bit of humming and hawing and faffing around. Hugely important and very interesting actually treaty debates in January, and of course the election, and then there's the building up to the Civil War and then the Civil War itself. But we might just do it every 2 months instead of monthly, so that we can kind of get a meatier talk. Tonight's talk is very dense in terms of text, because we're going to be looking at the final hammering out of the treaty. So we are in a bi-location like St. Padre Pio. We're live and I have people in the room here, so apologies if it doesn't flow perfectly. So I'm just going to give a quick timeline first. Oh yeah, I turned that off. Actually, and let me go back. I'm going to give a quick timeline for November. So on the 24th of October, it was the last full plenary session. Now, those of you who've been tuning in know that we've talked about the fact that the British team were quite clever in that they very quickly separated out the Irish team, so that there wasn't, sorry, just moving, there wasn't these complete groups, meeting together. They split them off into little groups. Michael Collins was kind of the only one actually who went to everything. They were called subcommittees and plenary sessions and all of this. But very quickly they did isolate Collins and Griffith from everybody else. And I had told you there was kind of friction on the Irish team anyway, because a lot of them didn't trust Childers. They kind of thought he was there for, DeValera. So there's a lot of miscommunication on the Irish team, which the British have actually already kind of taken advantage of. So 24th of October, last full plenary session, the Irish draft proposals were presented, and then there were negotiations carried out between subcommittees on both delegations. Griffith and Collins met with Lloyd George and Chamberlain. Now, the interesting thing that comes into play in November, especially, and it's not something we talked about, I think, enough before, is the pressure that Lloyd George is under from his own party. The fact that he's leading a coalition government. He has hardline conservatives who happen to be unionists, who are really kind of fighting that fight. So empire and crown, super important to the backbenchers and to the conservatives, in his own party. So much so, in fact, that Craig doesn't really have to do anything. We've talked a little bit about this, and he comes into it again this month. They offer to have these conversations, but Craig doesn't actually have to do anything. He doesn't have to meet, he doesn't have to negotiate, because the Government of Ireland Act has passed. The country is partitioned, and he's running his country. He's got 6 counties, and he's got his parliament actively up and running. So on the 2nd of November, I just want to go through these first, and then we'll go into them in depth. On the 2nd of November, there's a series of meetings between Griffith and Collins with Lloyd George, Lord Birkenhead and Chamberlain. The main focus was Griffith's letter on recognising the king. The 12th of November, there's a meeting again between Griffith and Lloyd George. Griffith agreed to written proposals on the Ulster issue, which was later used by Lloyd George in a way that Griffith had not anticipated. Now, the Ulster question is incredibly important and interesting from all of their points of view. And I think, all of the sides kind of drop the can, if that's or kick the can of Ulster down the road. As I say, Craig had absented himself from the talks, but both the Irish and the British sides come up very quickly with this, we'll have a boundary commission, or we'll have an election where we will allow the 6 counties to decide themselves. They sort of thought Fermanagh, and another one would go very quickly, Catholic majority would push it out of the union. And so that Ulster would be left economically unviable. So everyone seems to agree with this, even the hardliners back in Dublin. Like you'll see again and again in the correspondence, and later on when we do the treaty debates, they're not super concerned with talking about Ulster. So on the 22nd of November, the Irish memorandum, which sets out a summary of the discussions to date, repeating the proposal about external association, which DeValera has been banging on about since June. Some of this is reworded by, not reworded, but drafted by Childers. There's actually very fraught discussions among the Irish team. Arthur Griffiths, doesn't agree with Childers' interpretation of events, but eventually allows the memo to go through. The British response is conveyed back on the 24th of November, particularly by Birkenhead, who insists on recognition of the Crown. And then on the 28th of November, Lloyd George offers to put into writing any phrase which would guarantee Ireland's equal status with Canada as a dominion. So don't forget, they're offering this dominion status. It is a compromise from Britain's point of view, really. We'll get to that later. On the 1st of December, the team go home. They have this fraught cabinet meetings, very, very personal discussions between the likes of Arthur Griffiths and Collins on one side and Austin Stack and Cathal Brugha on the other. It's really, really horrific kind of meetings. They come back, and the British have counter proposals, first of all, they present in Dublin, the counter proposals, including the wording of the Oath of Allegiance. The Irish delegates return to Dublin, have this cabinet meeting where they discuss, and naturally the divisions are very evident. The decision is reached to try to follow the original instructions, not to consent to the Oath of Allegiance as worded, if required, to end negotiations to break down on Ulster, and DeValera refuses to go. Now, his whole raison d'etre earlier for staying had been that when push comes to shove and when we were, dying on our feet, then he would go. You're not going to get a counter proposal. And so when he chooses not to go back on the 3rd of December, then we know what happens on the 4th. So Collins and Griffith met with Austin Chamberlain on the 26th of October about Ulster. At this meeting, the British hinted that they might be willing to alter the 1920 Government of Ireland Act by placing the 6th County Parliament under the authority of the Dublin Parliament. So it would still be devolved, but instead of answering to Westminster, it would answer to Dublin. Writing to Eamon de Valera, Arthur Griffith said that he and Collins had agreed because that might form a possible basis for a settlement. At the end of the meeting, Griffith told Chamberlain that no Irishman could even discuss an association with the British Crown until the essential unity of Ireland was agreed to by the parties. And of course, this is something that they don't really stick to. The problem for the Irish side was that to wring any concession from the British meant that they had to give ground on crucial issues, which only encouraged the British to get even more concessions, wrung out of them. And Britain had not conceded one real, thing. So the first major concession in the late October was put into writing, which accepted Irish naval facilities for use by the British on the Irish coast. And so that was conceded in writing. The other notable clause was that in the Irish reply was the concession that the elected government of a free and undivided Ireland would be prepared to recognise the king as head of the association of states that form the British Empire. Griffith reports this to de Valera, and de Valera kind of does note, with a little bit of concern, where the talks are headed. Now, the British position has not changed since July 20th on that. So it can't have been a surprise to anybody. Really the Irish delegation were being led slowly towards this position where a self-governing sort of Ireland would be firmly placed within the empire. Griffith wrote to de Valera that the British indicated to him that if the Irish conceded on the crown, the British government would send for James Craig to press him into coming into a self-governing Irish state. But of course, that was all very airy-fairy too. On the October 30th, Griffith met Lloyd George at the home of Winston Churchill. God, what am I doing? Collins would later join the meeting. Lloyd George told Griffith he was coming under increasing pressure from the die-hard wing, which had put a vote of censure against his government before the House of Commons. He said the Irish memorandum was not clear enough on key issues of concern, such as the Crown, free partnership with the Empire, and defence. Thomas Jones. And the other interesting thing too, I should say, is we kind of in Ireland and maybe even in Irish America, Frank Pakenham's book, Peace by Ordeal, was the authority on the Irish treaty talks until, the 70s. Tom Jones, who was a Welsh-speaking secretary to Lloyd George and to the delegation, his diaries came out in the early 70s, and they shed an entirely different, kind of look, particularly, I guess, from the British side. So we had this one-sided view of kind of an innocent, naive Griffith, led into and a compromise by accident until the 70s. So Tom Jones wrote in his diary that he informed Lloyd George of his belief that Childers was responsible for, quote, meticulous qualifications that the Irish responses were wrapped up in. Lloyd George assured Griffith that if he would give personal assurances on these matters, he would be able to force down the opposition within his own government, and he would fight Ulster to secure essential unity. Griffith replied that the Irish side would recommend recognition of the Crown, provided they were satisfied on the other points at issue. Now, that still is not, as far as Griffith is concerned, agreement. He's waiting to see what the other side says. And so all that was left was the formula, really, of words to do with the association within the empire. Pakenham, however, commented that Griffith had satisfied the British, and at what cost would soon become evident. On the events from this, last weekend in October to November 2nd, Pakenham wrote in his history, yet insofar as the negotiations are to be thought of as a gradual surrender of the Republic before a mixture of force majeure and diplomatic finesse, these days from October 30th to November 2nd, especially the first two of them, can be said to have sealed its fate. And I don't know if that's necessarily fair, to Griffith. So I'm just going to go through these texts. There's a lot of them, but mostly we won't read, every line. But the big thing to show is how intensely involved Dublin was. They're writing almost every day, which I will say adds to their strain. So not only are they in talks all day, every day, then they have to go home and write memorandums, draft things. They do have these lady typists, who are helping. They have Childers, of course, acting as secretary. Sometimes they're going back themselves on the boat. They don't really trust, the phone lines or telegrams. So they have either members of Collins's squad and other bodyguards. Collins himself makes one or two overnight journeys. So they're back and forth, to Dublin with communiques all the time. So on the 2nd, Griffith gave the Prime Minister basically a written promise that he would recommend recognition of the British Crown if satisfied on all the other points. Now, so this is that letter. Let me move the little video out of your way. He thought that he was accepting this still as kind of very tentative, He said that the attitude of mind was conditional on the recognition of the essential unity of Ireland as to the northeast of Ireland, while reserving for further discussion the question of area. So again, no one is demanding all 6 counties. I would agree to any necessary safeguards and to the maintenance of existing parliamentary powers, and would agree that its industrial life should not be hampered or discriminated against in any way. So, he's maybe making a little bit of a concession, but I honestly can't see that this is so much different from, what they knew the British were looking for since July. Then he writes to DeValera on the 3rd about this. Following my conversation with Lloyd George, which I've described to you, he asked me to write him a letter embodying the personal assurances I gave him in order that he might take his stand against Craig and the Ulster men if they proved obdurate. Yesterday I drafted the letter, and at Birkenhead's request, I, with Mr. Collins, met him. He suggested some alterations, and we arranged to meet him and Lloyd George later. We met last night and discussed for 2 hours the terms of the letter. 6 or 7 alterations were suggested. So this is draft upon draft, 2 were accepted, 1 declined, and in the other cases, we met the point eventually by a redraft of the wording. So I have adhered to the basis of our memo to them, he says. They are satisfied to face the Ulster question on it and assure me that if Ulster proves unreasonable, this is interesting, they are prepared to resign rather than use force against us. So England, whether they were lying or not, seemed to have suggested, or the British team seemed to have suggested, that they will not push Ireland if the Ulster doesn't agree. But of course, as I say, Craig sidesteps these talks. In such an event, no English government is capable of formation on a war policy against Ireland. So he said, the tactical course I have followed has been to throw the question of Ulster against the questions of association and the Crown. This is now the position. The British government is up against Ulster, and we for the moment are standing aside. So he thinks this is an internal, British active union thing. I don't even have to get involved. If they secure Ulster's consent, we shall have gained essential unity, and the difficulty we shall be up against will be the formula of association and recognition. You will observe my wording, which they accept is consistent with external association and external recognition. And we talked, back in those summer talks when DeValera was doing it, like the semantics of this, the difference between external association and dominion status, like it was tiny, tiny words. So he says, they're sending for Craig tomorrow. It's fantastic. They are anxious that their proposed way of dealing with an obdurate Ulster should be kept for the moment quite secret. Surprise, surprise. I trust, therefore, that only members of the inner cabinet shall be acquainted with it. So that was basically DeValera, Brugha and Stack at home. So, he definitely thinks this is just a tactic. But Lloyd George refused to proceed with this tactic of going up against the North unless Griffith gave him the assurances that he would not publicly repudiate it. And so, Griffith agrees with that. And then later on, this is what Griffith says was binding. Now, this letter is dated the 8th of November. So you can see these are, almost daily. Today, Michael Collins and myself were asked unofficially to see Jones, Lloyd George's secretary, at Whitehall Gardens. We declined, but agreed to meet him at our headquarters, the Grosvenor. Does this movement kind of gain anything? I doubt it. He told us that Craig is standing pat, refuses to come under any All-Ireland Parliament, refuses to change six-county area. He said that Lloyd George is going to put up to the Ulster government on Thursday the proposal that they should accept the six-county area under an Irish Parliament. If they refuse, he will go down to House of Commons and announce his resignation. Probably had no intention, of doing that. Birkenhead and Chamberlain will probably resign along with him, but they will do nothing further. This is Jones' statement. Said they would not dissolve, giving various reasons, nor go into opposition. Lloyd George would retire altogether from public life. Bonar Law would probably form a militarist government against Ireland. So this is the danger, like in one hand, that if the hardline Conservatives take over, what are they going to get, He said he had a scheme in his own mind that Lloyd George should, as an alternative to the Ulster refusal, offer to set up a government for the 26 counties with all the proposed powers, and then appoint a boundary commission to delimit Ulster, confining this Ulster to its Partition Act powers. That would give us most of Tyrone, Fermanagh and part of Armagh down. So again, make Ulster so small that it was economically unviable. We did not give any definite opinion on the matter. It is their lookout for the moment. Again, he sees this as internal, coalition party government things that have to happen. He is to see us again tomorrow. It is partly bluff, but not wholly. It is possible the conference may end with this week. So they're a little bit stressed. If so, all policy dictates it should end on the note of Ulster being the impossibilist in order to throw the dominions against her. So, they think that this tactic has worked for them. Then DeValera replies, and look at all these. I got your letter, October 7th, 31st, November 1st, 3rd, 5th, 8th. As you know, I have been of opinion from the very beginning of the negotiations that if the conference had to break, the best issue to break on would be Ulster, provided we could so manage it that Ulster could not go out with the cry of attachment to the empire and loyalty to the throne. The difficulty, of course, was to secure this without jeopardizing our own fundamental position. There can be no doubt whatever that the delegation has managed to do this admirably. And if a break occurs at this stage, Ulster will be crushed between the public opinion of both countries as well as the public opinion of the world, if it counts for anything. This view is shared by everyone here, so that we should be quite unanimous on it. The danger now is that we should be tempted, in order to put them more hopelessly in the wrong, to make further advances on our side. So DeValera is saying, go softly. I think as far as the Crown and Empire connection is concerned, we should not budge a single inch from the point where the negotiations have now led us. P.S. Were it not that it might cut across our policy of placing the onus upon Ulster, I would have had a reply made to the statements appearing in this morning's press. Worthington Evans was on the delegation. You will, I suppose, haul them up on it in the conference. They must not be allowed to get away with that sort of stuff. It is likely to do a great deal of harm. Now, I can't remember exactly what he's talking about there, but I think there was a little bit of a mention made, by the British that they were having these negotiations around Ulster. And so that is the problem. But like Craig has completely got all of the British Conservative support behind him. And so he knows that Bonar Law in particular, Lloyd George knows that Bonar Law would have sprung to their defence. And so this allows Craig to stymie this kind of underhanded tactic, which we don't really believe, I think, of Lloyd George's, as well as pushing Dublin to be the one, that'll have to make the break. Now, but it wasn't only the North that was a problem for Griffith and for Collins. It's easy to see that the Irish should have been adamant about unity, but they kept making these concessions on other things like trade and defence and all of that. So there was an oversensitivity to, on their part, to a minority of the hardline Republicans might have prevented this happening. Griffith would have preferred to pursue this kind of softly, and they knew sending him that he was more willing to compromise. But the confusion of unity and allegiance meant that neither of those key issues was kind of served in the end, because they kept misdefining them. Griffith suffered from a common nationalist blind spot in his belief that the Ulster Unionists would dance to the British tune. The British government had been unable to bend them in 1914, during the gun running, don't forget, 1916 or 1917, and it was now even less likely to happen in 1921 with a government established in Belfast. So Griffith, should he have ignored the illusory alternative of an aggressively anti-Irish regime and held Lloyd George fast to his promise to resign if Lloyd George could not, offer unity? And maybe that was the tactic they should have, but they completely accept that Lloyd George is going to haul Craig in, everyone will agree, and it'll be perfect. It seems likely that had Lloyd George been forced by Griffith to resign, of course, his place would have been taken by a Tory government, which might well have resumed an occupied coercion in Ireland, and Jones's diary sort of says this, like that this was the tension Lloyd George was struggling with behind the scenes. So the Boundary Commission was first mooted in that letter on the 8th. He wrote to DeValera that he thought it would remove at least 2 counties and parts of others. He felt the conference would end within a week, and so let it do so because of the Unionist intransigence. And this was really trying to reinforce what DeValera had expressed himself. He did not rule out at this point concessions on the unity question. And we don't have any record except for this note back that, Dublin didn't agree with them on that. Sorry, this note back. So DeValera doesn't say that he's not happy, about the Boundary Commission or that we should fight more on Ulster. So Griffith firmly believed that the Boundary Commission would bring about a united Ireland. And he was encouraged to do so, by the British. So Lloyd George told his cabinet that if Northern Ireland remained outside the jurisdiction of an All-Ireland Parliament, it could not retain 2 of the counties. Now, on the 12th of November, I've just seen him. His colleagues are sending a further reply to the Ulstermen offering to create an All-Ireland Parliament. Ulster would have the right to vote itself out within 12 months. If it does that, a Boundary Commission will be set up to delimit the area, and the part that remains after the Commission had acted would be subject to equal financial burdens with England. So, England have come again. Did I move it on for you? Yeah. So England have come back again, like we're going to force them, and it's going to be no problem. Now they have 12 months to opt out, and then we're going to enforce this Boundary Commission. He said this would be their last word to Ulster. If they refused, as he believed they would, he would fight, summon Parliament, appeal to it against Ulster. I told him it was his proposal, not ours. He agreed, but said that when they were fighting next Thursday with the diehards and Ulster in front, they were lost if we cut ground away behind them by repudiating the proposal. So he's backed the Irish into saying, yeah, we'll take this Boundary Commission. I said we could not do that. I couldn't guarantee its acceptance. And as of course, my colleagues knew nothing of it yet, but I would guarantee that while he was fighting the Ulster crowd, we would not help them by repudiating him. So Griffith is a bit maybe too conciliatory. Here's Collins leaving Downing Street. I just put in a picture to show you because there's a lot of text. So the cabinet meetings in Dublin on the 13th, the president is of the opinion that whilst the utmost cooperation should exist between Dublin and London, the plenipotentiary should have a perfectly free hand, which should follow original instructions re important decisions. Now, you might remember there were two separate sets of original instructions. One was you have full power to conclude a treaty. The other one was, but come back to the Dáil secretly, to the cabinet, and tell us. So again, that's clear as mud. Following a lengthy and general discussion of the situation, the president expressed it as his opinion that it would be advisable to come to concrete proposals as soon as possible, and that if a break is inevitable, Ulster would be the best question on which to break. So like they keep repeating, themselves. The 18th of November, Eamon Akara, a friend, Mr. Collins, who is returning today, will inform you of the details of our conversation with Lloyd George and Birkenhead this morning. The document they have sent us is not the draft of a treaty, but tentative suggestions. We should reply to it, therefore, with a similar document, not with the treaty draft, reserving that until the last. The crucial question, Crown and Empire, must be met next week. If Ulster gets us to break on them, she will have re-won the game. The seriousness of this position will be realised by the members of Cabinet, and I trust they will give us their best weighed suggestions. So this is kind of the problem. I want to see if I need to tell you any of this. Yeah, so now there are differences in Griffiths' account of events and Austin Chamberlain's account of these events. The differences were kind of important. Griffiths' account omits the fact that he was given a proposal in writing and consented to its contents about the North. And he only mentioned his conversation with Lloyd George the previous day. Chamberlain's account mentioned both meetings and notes that Griffith agreed not to let Lloyd George down on the Ulster proposals. It stood that Lloyd George had managed to get Griffith, whether implicitly or explicitly, to agree to support in writing a means to secure the essential unity of Ireland on which the major Irish concessions were contingent. And so that he had him over a barrel really later on, because he said, you agreed you wouldn't break on this, and it's not our fault, that Craig wouldn't do what we asked, and so you have to continue kind of to go. So Griffith really believed that he had only agreed to a plan that he thought would keep negotiations moving along, but the British considered this to be something very potent. Lloyd George had handcuffed him on Ulster, and unless he would go back on his word, he was trapped. So as of November 12th, those documents, Griffith seems to have agreed to a plan for the Irish delegation, which was not sprung again until December 6th when they're signing the treaty. And so the essential unity is not really guaranteed because Ulster have this opt-out, clause. So this is the memorandum of the Irish representatives. This was the document that I was telling you. Childers, Gavin, Duffy and Barton drafted this, and Griffith actually didn't agree with a lot of it and kind of reprimanded them, but then agreed to let it be sent. So these are this response to the draft treaty that the British have given them. And again, it's a little bit, wishy-washy. Legislative and executive authority in Ireland should be derived exclusively from the elected representatives. Ireland agrees to be associated with the British Commonwealth for purposes of common concern, to recognise the Crown as the symbol and accepted head of the association. And I have to say, it's not a million miles away from what they actually do sign in the treaty. So like they are getting concessions too. They're just semantic concessions. Varying proposals have been put forward by the British government on the subject of naval defence. So this was kind of the current sticking point, and maybe it was all a distraction to get them off of the Ulster question. The Irish delegation now asks that the facilities required by the British government should be precisely defined. So that one was particularly sticking, how much of a military presence will the British have in Ireland? Having stated our willingness to provide such safeguards as will allay the fears of any section of the population of North East Ulster, we now suggest that it is necessary at this stage to indicate precisely to us what safeguards are required so that every eventuality may be met and any conceivable misunderstanding avoided. And so you can kind of see that this is what DeValera is talking about, like you have to get it spelled out. What exactly are they asking us for and what exactly are they prepared to give us? So here again is, and this, we won't even read this because I think we did it in October, but this was a very angry document from Childers saying, like, this is everything we've already compromised on. We, out of the 10 paragraphs, numbers 1 and 7 are the only ones which do not make concessions, so he's just comparing the language like that. We have already given. And he says why. So like, look at number 2, for instance. This is a grave step when the most powerful state of this group in the Dominions, the Commonwealth, is her close neighbour and secular enemy and oppressor. In such cases, human experience proves that the best security, not perfect, but incomparably the best, is a detached, independent status resting solely on international right. It is distance only which has led to the relationship known as Dominion status, a de facto sovereignty qualified by theoretical ties. So he says, like, it's great for Canada, Australia, there's an ocean between you. Like, you know, we cannot have Dominion status like these boys because we're right there. Ireland would prefer, if left to herself, to proceed on her own path, friendly with all nations, without risk of implication in wars, oppression of small nations, and all the possible consequences of association with a militarist empire covering a quarter of the globe. Purports to save her freedom of action, but again, she is the close and helpless neighbour of England. And I mean, he's not wrong there, you know. So this is not super helpful, and they do publish this document. Yeah. And then this accompanying memo with it was handed in at Downing Street. So they gave Downing Street that memo, you know, like, this is everything we've done, this is why it's not acceptable. Half an hour later, Jones rang me up, Arthur Griffiths is writing to DeValera, and asked, could he see me immediately? I told him to come to Hans Place, where he arrived at 8:15. He said Lloyd George was in despair about the document. Birkenhead and Chamberlain considered it impossible, you know, two hardliners. It did not accept the Crown or the Empire. It brought them back to where they were 6 weeks ago. He suggested the document should be withdrawn or substituted, as Lloyd George's only idea of a reply to it was a letter ending negotiations. Now, this is the 22nd of November. I said it couldn't be withdrawn or substituted. It was, in my judgment, a great advance on our side towards peace. As to the Crown and Empire, we had indicated a method of association which was honourable to both sides. As to naval facilities, it was the Admiralty's fault, not ours, if the matter was in a fog, because they had sent us contradictory or at least inconsistent memoranda. We have asked them to exactly define the facilities they needed, and we would seek to find an agreement with them. As to trade, I held our proposal was quite reasonable, although I admitted to him as my own opinion that it was not so great an issue as others. As to Ulster, I said we had made a great offer because they have said we'll do this boundary commission thing. So now we have arranged to meet Lloyd George and Birkenhead and possibly Chamberlain at 10 Downing Street tomorrow. We shall argue the acceptability of the arrangement reassociation we have proposed, but I have little hope of any good result. If the conversation fails, I presume Lloyd George will send a letter terminating the negotiations, and to this we shall reply and then leave London for home, unless you think the time has come for you to cross over here. We had that conversation and we've kept our best player on the bench. Now is the time. On that point, until after our conversation with the British representatives tomorrow, I could form no judgment. So, and the other point to bring up here when he says that, do we even know that they would have been allowed leave? Michael Collins was one of the most wanted men in the world at the time. His photograph had been plastered everywhere in London, you know, since he had kind of come out into public, because they didn't really know, you know, who he was before. So I'm not, maybe like they're not even sure could they get home under diplomatic immunity if you know they get a letter tomorrow saying we're gone back to war. I would have arrested them all, you know. So I think they're in an awful situation that they're really not getting enough sympathy for, like, from Dublin. So this is his memo home after the meeting. We met them this morning, Collins, Barton and myself. So Barton was included. On the Crown, they declared they had no alternative. They must fight. We put up our counter proposal briefly, but they declared it impossible. On the Navy, they were very strong, claiming that all facilities needed must be granted. In the end, they do, you know, come down, and there's only 3 treaty ports kept. It appeared as if they were claiming the occupation of all or of any of our ports for naval purposes. It transpired later that they were thinking of a state of war, not of a state of peace. When this was cleared up, they moved towards us. So on the whole, there was a slight advance in our favor here. But again, that might have been strategy, you know, pretend they wanted more than they actually did. On trade, Lloyd George maintained his free trade attitude, but it was fairly satisfactorily explained what number 9 in that memorandum had meant. It means, they say, merely that neither country shall issue prohibition against the commodities of the other country and nothing more. So free trade between the two entities. This, however, would not prevent either country, in case of disease, etc., closing its ports against the importation of a diseased commodity. Now, 22nd, you know, this is coming up to, what date is it? Yeah, the 23rd. On Ulster, Lloyd George declared that I had assured him I would not let him down if he put up the proposals embodied in their memorandum to Craig. and we had not embodied them in our memorandum. I said I had given him the assurance, and I repeated it, but I told him it was his proposal, not ours. Therefore, it doesn't appear in our document. Our proposal was, in our opinion, better, but it was different, and he was satisfied. He had misunderstood us in this instance and said as much. So Griffith is still not saying, like, I don't agree with your thing. He's just saying we didn't write it into our document. He would put his proposal to Craig from himself only. He would like to consult privately with his colleagues for a few minutes. They retired and consulted. On their return, Lloyd George said that before he met Craig, he must know where he stood in the fundamentals. If we had to fight on fundamentals, there was no help for it, but it would be a tragedy if we broke up on any verbal or technical misunderstandings. He suggested, therefore, that as myself and Mr. Collins had seen Birkenhead before I wrote the letter in which they'd been acting, we should do so again and go over the document with him. Birkenhead suggested we should bring a constitutional lawyer with us. We have arranged to meet him tomorrow at 10:30 and to bring Mr. Chartres, another secretary, who had been a publicist. Lloyd George had postponed his interview with Craig until 5 in the evening to await the result, if any, of that meeting. Now, meanwhile, the cabinet in Dublin, the following formula for the oath, they have unanimously approved this, that Ireland shall recognise the British Crown for the purposes of the association as symbol and accepted head of the combination of associated states, and they would give money to the civil list. And actually the eventual oath is not very far from that. They actually insert the oath as loyalty to the state, and there's an oath of fidelity to the British Crown, who is the symbol and head. Okay. So again, they're gone back with that document, you know, that they had already gone back with Ireland should be associated, yada, yada. As a token of that recognition, the Irish legislature will vote an annual contribution. So they've moved that one in. And again, this was just a memo, you know, for them to kind of better explain to Britain. But they're reasserting this thing about security and the fact that they're too close. It is fallacious to assert that Ireland is offered the substantial freedom of Canada and the other British dominions. Canada and the other dominions lie thousands of miles away, right? They have no desire nor temptation to interfere in their home affairs. The Crown to them is a symbol of the external unity of equal states, not of the internal repression of subordinate states. Ireland lies beside the shores of Great Britain, has been accustomed for generations to interfere in the name of the Crown in every detail of Ireland's life. The desire and temptation to continue interference will remain if the Crown remains, as it cannot be the symbolic Crown that the Dominion knows, but will continue to possess the real power of repression and veto which Ireland knows. Now, that is maybe a matter of interpretation. You know, I mean, definitely, obviously, the physical distance is there or not there, but it's, you know, I mean, you would have to hope that the British were in good faith giving it the same status as Canada and Australia. So equally, it must be recognized on the other side that the same propinquity, I don't know, imposes on us a necessity for safeguarding our independence, which does not arise in the case of the dominions. So the Crown, thousands of miles away, will never menace the dominions with its powers. The Crown, close at hand to Ireland, would form a constant menace of the kind, and the object for which both sides have striven, the satisfactory ending of the long conflict between the two nations, would not have been achieved. So, you know, we want complete separation, something that is practicable and honourable, that will ensure Great Britain against every apprehension that her publicists have expressed that will associate Ireland with her and the dominions under the Crown. It must be recognised that for Ireland freely to accept the Crown in any capacity is a momentous step on her part in view of history and the existing facts, but the desire of the people of Ireland for a friendly and lasting settlement is unquestionable, and the Irish delegation are ready to advise their countrymen to meet British sentiment in the manner here proposed. So I just think these are such circular documents, you know, that have been going and going and going, and it's very clear, like, Britain is not going to accept anything less than what they have proposed. So the 29th, we've met at Lloyd George's request in Chequers, you know, the home, the kind of holiday home, with Lord Birkenhead and Sir Robert Home. Again, the document we'd sent them was impossible for them. No British government could attempt to propose to the British people the abrogation of the Crown. It would be splashed to atoms. We told them we had no authority to deal with them on any other basis than the exclusion of the Crown from purely Irish affairs. We entered into a general discussion in which they knocked out my argument that the crown and the dominions was merely a symbol, but in Ireland a reality, by offering to put in any phrase in the treaty we liked to ensure that the function of the crown should be no more in practice than it is in Canada, which I think was probably a good faith offer. On the oath of allegiance, which we instanced in part of the conversation, they said, though it was an immense difficulty for them, they would try to modify it if that would help us. So on the elective head of the Irish state, they point out that the elective head of any state is the premier. They guaranteed that any nominal head would only be appointed in consultation with the Irish ministry. So, this lieutenant governor kind of thing that they used to have. In reply to our questions, they guaranteed that this figurehead who would represent the king would have no power. As the first president of Ireland, the figurehead. It's essential a cabinet meeting should be held. Now, so that's kind of the final offer from the British. We cannot write out the king, but we're conceding on these 2 or 3 points. It's essential a cabinet meeting, he tells DeValera, should be held. I shall return to Dublin on Friday morning and hope to see you on that evening. Please have a cabinet meeting arranged for Saturday morning when we shall all be there. I intend to return to London on that evening because they're under pressure, from the British. And I think this is so interesting. DeValera writes to Harry Boland, who was still in America at the time in Washington, "My dear Harry, as things stand today, it means war." Lloyd George or, Griffith thinks they're practically ready to sign. "The British ultimatum is allegiance to their king. We will never recommend that such allegiance be rendered," which is not what he's really saying to Griffith. "You know how fully I appreciate all that war means to our people and what my misgivings are as to the outcome of war. Without explanation, you will understand then, if I appear with those who choose war, it is only because the alternative is impossible without dishonor." I mean, I still find it fascinating that he won't go to London then himself. Like, if he's now at the point where he thinks we're at war, is this not when he should go to negotiate? "For us to recommend that our people should subscribe with their lips to an allegiance which they could not render in their hearts would be to recommend to them subscription to a living lie and the abandonment of the supreme issue in the struggle through all the centuries. As far as I am concerned, it is now external association, yes. Internal association involving allegiance, no." Which he knew in July, was not going to happen. "I am writing before the final recommendation of our plenipotentiaries is made, so I'm speaking solely for myself, but it is likely that my view will be that of the cabinet as a whole," which of course it wasn't, it was the minority cabinet. "You will have a heavy task keeping our end up before American public opinion. When the proposals of our plenipotentiaries are published, point to them as showing the distances we have been ready to go to meet the demands of the British and allay their fears, however groundless, that further than this we could not go without betrayal of our principles and of our dead. I have been told that it was said in inner circles in English politics that if the English representatives at the Washington conference could secure a certain object which they had in view without settling the Irish question, then they would not bother trying to settle it. What the object is, cancellation of British debt, English-speaking alliance, or a scheme of disarmament which would leave England top dog on the sea and land. Don't forget, all of this is going on like under the United Nations or League of Nations, backdrop. I have not been able to find out. But it would appear that if the British can get what they want in Washington, it means war to the knife against us. The danger is that they will succeed in America while we are talking here. So he doesn't really seem to respond to Lloyd George or to Griffith. Lloyd George officially sends this: "I enclose a draft of the treaty which we are prepared to submit for the approval of Parliament." So both parliaments have to ratify it. "Provisions for protecting the interests of Southern Unionists," interesting, first time we've heard about them, "are not included in this draft because we understand that you have agreed with their representatives to provide safeguard for the representations of minorities, especially in the second chamber, the Senate, and in respect of education, religious freedom and church property, etc., not less effective than those afforded by the Government of Ireland Act 1920, as well as to make provision for the completion of land purchase." Now, that's absolutely incredible. The first time we've heard about the Ulster or the Southern, Protestants, who most of whom are burned out, in the following years. Very interesting. So I just wanted to show you that this is, the secret document, and I wanted to show you the oath and this whole community of nations. So Ireland shall have the same national status in the community of nations known as the British Empire as the Dominion of Canada. They all had a different name: the Commonwealth of Australia, the Dominion of New Zealand, and the Union of South Africa. So I think that's interesting that there's different titles for the same relationship depending on what country. With a parliament having powers to make laws for the peace, order, and good government of Ireland, and an executive responsible to that parliament, and shall be styled and known as the Irish Free State. The oath to be taken by members of the parliament to the Irish Free State shall be in the following form: I solemnly swear to bear true faith and allegiance to the Constitution of the Irish Free State, to the community of nations known as the British Empire, and to the King as the head of the state and of the empire. And that is not what is finally signed in December. They do get concessions on that. And the other thing worth noticing is this, concession for Ulster: if after the expiration of 6 months and before 12 months an address is presented to His Majesty by both houses of Parliament of Northern Ireland, the powers of the Parliament and government of the Irish Free State shall no longer extend to Northern Ireland, and a commission shall be appointed by the British government to determine, in accordance with the wishes of the inhabitants, as far as may be compatible with the economic and geographic conditions, the boundaries between Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland. And that wasn't an issue for anyone. Important to note that. So this is the copy that Michael Collins brings home. You can find this on the internet, on the Department of Foreign Affairs. And actually, Griffiths is even more worked up, but I just wanted to show you how many notations and drafts and asterisks. So he brings this back with him. Of course, Michael Collins is Minister for Finance, so he has some interesting kind of things. Look, the wealth of nations, he's really marking up that one. No protective customs duties. He wants entire article number 10. 12 big question mark, so it's just interesting to see these. And cross. So they do get some of these when they come back, but we're not going to be talking about them coming back until next month. And the other thing I wanted to show you, to try to end on a kind of a light note, is this was sold recently at auction, and it's hard to read the writing, but they were kind of joking, the Irish delegation, amongst themselves. So apparently there was huge drinking going on at the time, and maybe like as a stress relief as opposed to celebrations. But the bills exist for £500 a night. So they were having a dinner, and they have rewritten this little menu, which I think is kind of funny on one hand, but also a little bit sad on the other. So the dishes relate to the talks. The soup is peace is a thick soup, or publicity is clear. Fish is Hans Place, place the fish, or Cadogan steaks. The Irish delegates were staying at Hans Place and Cadogan Gardens. The entrees are economic cutlets with reparation gravy, minced Ulster northeast sauce, or the joint roast beef of Old England, with aide memoire of potatoes, which is the delegate solution, or a formula of beans, which is the English solution. The sweets are a compote of fruits, which are Gertie, Alice, Kathleen, and Lily, who were the Irish secretaries, jokingly referred to there as a dessert or a sweet. So very, very, they leave it very, very tense with Britain, very tense within themselves. And of course, they're going back into a government, or a cabinet at least, that is very, very divided. And it seems clear, I think, from DeValera's letter to Harry Boland, that he does not see himself as going back, to resume the talks, even though that was the entire basis for them going, kind of in the first place. So if there's any questions from either our live audience here, or I have to go in and see what is happening on Facebook, I'll take questions or comments. Anyone have? Dan? Everybody? Right, good.
Just seems as we go through this
Mm-hmm.
and coming out of the war into the treaty process,
Mm-hmm.
that the Irish essentially, and that last memo, but that was between them.
Yeah.
They don't use the threat of going back to war as any kind of leverage.
The Irish?
The Irish.
Oh yeah, absolutely not. Yeah.
So it's almost like they surrendered that option to get in there. That was never anything that they would say, well, it was us, well, let's go back to war.
Yeah.
They did not do that.
They're in absolutely no position, to do it. Michael Collins, as minister for, well, he was Minister for Finance, but in charge of the IRB, you know, and they reckon there is possibly one gun per man, and each gun has one cartridge. Like they and the fact, to be honest, is this whole machinery of guerrilla warfare, particularly in the south, there still is violence up in the north, and don't forget they're actively arming the north, you know, trying to keep the Catholics up there safe. So to try to grind that back up, like these flying columns are kind of semi-retired, you know, some of them have gone back to work. I think absolutely the Irish were in no shape or form.
They might not have been, but they couldn't have.
They didn't even suggest it. No. I mean, I think the likes of DeValera amongst himself, you know, does, and earlier on too, there was some kind of mention of, well, if we have to go back, we have to go back. But I think, you know, I can only imagine, certainly Collins must have been worried about, will I be able to get out of London? Like, if these talks stall, will the door be blocked, you know? And then really, like, you know, Mulcahy hadn't run the war, DeValera certainly hadn't. DeValera's whole idea was like, we should do 1916 over and have, you know, these grand gestures with kind of honor. So it never seems to have been put forward, no, by the Irish. I think even privately, I don't think they wanted to return to war, which is funny. Oh, DeValera, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, he was prepared, and he remains prepared. Like, you know, his next speeches are about wading through the blood of Irishmen, you know. He wasn't afraid at all of the violence, I think, which is interesting, considering he didn't really have to fight. Yeah, well, you know, yeah, they were absolutely, like, I think the majority, I mean, definitely what eventually happens is they do go to a boundary commission. See, like the Civil War destroys everything. Like, maybe it would have worked had we not had a civil war where they deliberately burn, you know, Southern Protestant landlords out of it and all of that. But what eventually happens is they draw up a commission. Tom Jones is still involved, and somewhere around 1925, they've taken all these deed polls. They're kind of going by majority Catholic, majority Protestant, and actually Ireland would have lost certain territory, and they're leaked, and everyone in the south, you know, there's absolute uproar, and so they just quash it and go back. Okay, we accept it. Yeah. So that's it. Like, they don't even take the full province. It's 6 of the 9 Ulster counties, you know. So yeah, and it has stayed that way. Yeah. And it's interesting, you know, I mean, we keep talking about this, that the dynamic of, you know, now at the moment with Brexit talks, you know, a kind of a minority government waiting for the, you know, I mean, the DUP waiting to see what way will Britain be loyal to them. You know, they held the balance of power during the Brexit thing. So it's interesting, that dynamic. Did you have a question? Mm-hmm.
Well, the biography, I can't remember the journalist's name, the biography of Michael Collins.
Oh, Tim Pat Coogan. Mm-hmm.
And I'm feeling the same frustration I did when I was reading that. Like,
did I quote him?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
He had some of the same excerpts and stuff. And it's like, well, will they or won't they? Did they or didn't they?
I know.
Who's in, who's out, and why do they keep seeming to leave Michael Collins hanging out all the time?
I know, yeah. I do feel very badly for Collins, I think. And I mean, it's hard because you feel so not objective, you know, when you're saying that. He wanted to be part of the talks, I think, the first time around. Like, he definitely wanted to be part of the solution for Ireland. You know, he was absolutely a realist about, you know, going up against the might of the British. But I know him and Griffiths, or, you know, I believe historians who say that him and Griffith absolutely felt they were being more or less set up by DeValera. Like, the DeValera knew in June and July, when he had gone up against the Welsh Wizard and didn't get any concessions, that there would be no concessions. That, you know, I mean, he says to him, apparently, you and I know I cannot come back with the Republic, but I will go because you're my chief and you've told me. Then.
Yeah, and just following up on that, again, I had the same issue with Colin following.
Yeah.
I mean, they came out of the war and got here, and he was the commander of the army. So he had an independent power base.
Yeah.
But he didn't seem to really exercise it as much. I mean, he seemed to.
So unofficially he had, and actually there was, I should have said that somewhere in that time. So Mulcahy and him do not get on. Like, there's not Mulcahy, Cathal Brugha, who was Minister for Defence, massive jealousy, you know, kind of thing. And during this time, while they're in England, DeValera and Brua try to change the heads of the Free State. This might be December, January rather than October, November, but they try to recall all of the heads of the army and literally kind of change leadership so that it's not Collins' men that are in there, because Collins was in there by proxy, like through the IRB, you know, he's in the back door. So, but they are not able to successfully manage that. So absolutely, like some of the people, particularly I think, you know, the more senior members in the army follow Collins, but a lot of the rank and file, you know, believed that the blood sacrifice was too much for this compromise, you know, which you know, it's just such a die-hard attitude that I don't understand it. Mm-hmm.
The other thing you mentioned, that I think in that biography, you mentioned how depleted the Irish troops and the Irish supplies were.
Yeah.
And how the British didn't really know how depleted it was.
Yeah.
And boy, if they ever found out, now we're really.
Yeah. And I'm sure that, so we're talking about the supplies, that absolutely must have weighed on them, because particularly like Collins is over in London, you know, writing feckin' memos and reading papers, and, you know, like he's not able to do the Ned Broy and all of this operation of intelligence that he had been doing in Dublin. So God only knows what Dublin Castle are discovering, you know, as the months go on. I mean, they have to have known that there wasn't a whole pile of arms in the country, you know, and especially like after the Treaty of Versailles, you know, America, don't forget, like DeValera didn't come back in 1921 with the load of arms. You know, where was all the American money gone? Kind of on hide. Some of it is still in America, you know, so like this injection of cash that they thought they'd be getting, they never got. And so I have no doubt, yeah, that the British must have suspected, you know, these boys can't crank up a war machine again, you know, because the troops hadn't left Ireland. So it was no problem, you know. Any other questions, Sandy? Did you have one? No.
Where were the Irish actually getting their arms from? British military supplies?
Little bit of everywhere. They got some from Germany, you know, during Casement's time in 1916, old Russian army guns. And apparently the bullets like didn't match the guns. They had bought again from Russia. They were buying, you know, some from America, but it wasn't like there was huge, you know, depots of arms coming in. And you're right, even British, like I think in the film it shows, you know, they rage when they go into a barracks, you know, they rage for what they can there. But they have really no stockpiles of ammunition, you know. It was amazing they achieved as much as they did, to be honest, you know.
Was Canada a player at all?
I don't really think so. I think, you know, yeah, like maybe since all the Fenian invasions in the 1870s annoyed Canada. And I mean, you know, everyone has just finished with World War I. It was a tough time, I think, to be someone else in the British Empire, you know, who had fought in the war for the empire or for the side of the empire, and then to be, you know, having this engagement going on. So I think the Commonwealth are largely quiet, you know, which is interesting. I mean, we know Smuts was very involved in the talks, the guy from South Africa, very involved in the talks for peace. But, you know, there wasn't a huge, I mean, individuals were coming home. I think actually one Canadian guy did go home, one Canadian did go home to fight. But, you know, and certainly Irish Americans went home, you know, to fight. But you weren't getting, you know, support from generals. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of, and I mean, again, it's very difficult. That's why I love looking at the documents. I kind of think that's the only way we can do it, you know, in one way. It's very difficult to look at it objectively because we have the benefit of 2020 hindsight. You know, I certainly have always preferred one side over the other, even before I was properly informed, you know. And so you try not to like allow your own opinions, you know, overweigh, but those documents, I think, speak for themselves. And I just, you know, I'm trying to imagine the frustration of the likes of Collins and Griffith. You know, they feel they're being spied on by their own team. This gobshite is coming back with the word external instead of inter, you know what I mean? Like very semantic changes. And the British just unflappable, like, you know, they're not moving. And they knew that going, you know, and then I really think it's duplicitous of DeValera to say to Harry Boland, like, it means war, and Griffith begging him the same day, like, you know, maybe now is the time for you to come. And he just doesn't, you know. And then when they have those cabinet debates in the 1st and 2nd of December, he refuses to go, you know. Mhm.
Just love the venue.
Yeah, I love the menu too. Yeah, yeah. Tell me.
Strictly matter of opinion,
Mm.
do you think that DeValera really never really wanted to negotiate anything in the first place? Why wouldn't he go? Why wouldn't he go unless this was just all an exercise that he allowed to take place so he could sit off and when it was all done, come right back to his real position and just dump it.
Yeah.
That's the feeling you get. What's your thing?
To be honest, and I might be unfair to the man, I think it's ego. I think that if they thought, if DeValera thought like that his document number 2, which he proposes again next week when the boys go home, if he thought that would be accepted, and if they could get some kind of wording on the on the oath, I think he would have absolutely accepted like the credit, for being the man who saved the Republic. But I think the fact that he knows, I do think he was sort of humiliated after the June-July talks with Lloyd George. Absolutely, after the Carson Craig meetings, that they go nowhere. He meets them twice, they go nowhere. He says, I can't go because I'm the symbol of the Republic, and that symbol can't be tarnished by compromise. But I think, yeah, hogwash, because you're either going to compromise, that's what negotiations are like, or you're not. And so, Collins possibly accurately said, like, the compromise was made in September when you agreed we would send a delegation. Like, already we've compromised because now we're talking instead of fighting. So I think DeValera could not stomach being the one who didn't get, what they wanted. And I mean, it's very interesting coming into the Civil War. He joins the army as a way down the line, like not a corporal, but like he's not in a position of power. So he kind of exiles himself a little bit in the next year or two, during this thing. And then in 1926, he's able to turn around, like the very thing that he's arguing now about the oath. In 1926, he says it's only an empty formula. Like, could you not have had that attitude in 1921, when we needed, and imagine if they had, like, I keep thinking if they had just, forced maybe the Ulster issue a little bit, or said, like, let's have this boundary commission, but the Civil War absolutely, I think, horrifies, and cements the intransigence, like, of the, the British, the Unionists in the North, who still talk about the, the slaughter of the apprentice boys and all that from the 1600s. So here you are slaughtering each other. It's not very welcoming, So I think it's his ego. And I mean, even the way he treats Collins and death, Collins doesn't get a gravestone until, is it the 30s, I think? And then only Collins's brother can attend the erection of the gravestone. Like, I think it's ego, absolutely. Which is not a good trait in a leader, like, yeah. Very common. Mm-hmm. Well, that's the other thing. Like, maybe he was afraid of these hardliners that I think yeah. And Collins says, the night that they signed the treaty, I have signed my actual death warrant, So maybe DeValera was afraid, I think it becomes very clear to him very quickly that he does not control these hardliners that he thought he controlled, And so, but like, he's very free with his words, I don't think you can ratchet up men like that and expect to control them. So when he's talking about we have to wade through the blood of our fellow Irishmen, there's men that were prepared to do that, like, so you've just fanned their fire, but yeah, he could have been afraid. That's a nicer way of looking at it. I tend not to. Yeah.
The ego.
The ego, yeah. I know, but also, like, would you not want to be the man who brought peace? Like, Collins writes this thing that doesn't get published. I can't remember the name of it now, but I'll talk to you about it next week or next month. Like, setting out that this is what we can do with this, or like, look at the concessions we got on trade. You look at the concessions we got, like, for the first time ever, we're going to be independent in all of these ways, And so there definitely was a framework within Collins's mind, even though he knew it was a very flawed document, this treaty, and they had kind of, compromised maybe more than he wanted to even. But he was a pragmatist when it came to the resurgence of violence couldn't happen. And he did have a framework for working within the treaty to expand that. And, DeValera just does not, like. And so I think that was the sort of the tragedy, that perhaps if we had not had the Civil War and they had worked together, they could have actually subverted the treaty a lot quicker than they did. you know. So there's no questions or comments, it looks like, on Facebook. You're very quiet tonight. But thanks everyone for watching. And we're back, when are we back? The 9th with Deirdre Sinnott. She's a writer from New York who's written a book about, it's called The Third Mrs. Galway. It's about the Underground Railroad up in Utica, New York. It's going to be brilliant, yeah. So that's Zoom, you know, online only. What else do we have? We have an Communities for Immunity project coming up. We're one of 51 museums and libraries across the country that are going to focus on the pandemic. So we will actually have a vaccine clinic here on the 20th. Now children can be get vaccinated from, you know, 5 to 12. We have flu shots or booster shots. So that will happen here. Everybody gets a little gift if they come. And we have a series of talks. So we have Karen Sonnenleiter from Siena. God, I hope that's right. She's going to talk about the famine era refugees and how they were kind of targeted for bringing in disease, the Irish fever as it was known. Then we have communities, that's on the 11th actually, the communities in the pandemic is on the 11th. We have Dr. Leanne Howe, who's a Cherokee Nation representative. We have Out Colorado talking to us, and we have our own Francis from the RISE, the Refugee and Immigrant Services Centre here in Albany. So they'll talk about how different communities have responded to the challenges of the pandemic. On the 15th, we have Dr. Sonnenleiter, and then on it's way later, I think it's the 30th or 20-something, we have Albany College of Pharmacy talking about science and the pandemic, and so the evolution of vaccines and mRNAs and bioethics of mandates and everything. It'll be very exciting. So stay tuned and check our Facebook page. We have Old Ireland in colour, we have loads of things. So thank you for joining us, and talk to you soon, hopefully. Take care.